Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, today we're going to do something a little different. We're going to bypass the famous miracles, the vast crowds, and the monumental historical events you probably already know. Instead, we're zooming in on a deeply human, entirely unrecorded moment. Picture this. Before he ever healed the sick, before he ever walked on water or fed thousands of people, Jesus stood in a small, dirt-floor workshop in Nazareth and grieved the death of his earthly father. We're going to reconstruct the quiet, relatable human experience of Joseph's death and figure out what it meant for the young man who had to bury him.
Okay, let's dive into this. It's incredibly easy to just skip straight to the cross or the sweeping public ministry. But before literally any of that, Jesus faced his first great loss, the quiet carpenter who raised him. The man who had been there since before he was born, the guy who taught him a trade and who protected him. Long before Jesus was the figure who changed history, he was simply a grieving son standing in a small workshop.
Now, I gotta be honest right up front. The Gospels are completely silent on this specific event. They don't give us the date of Joseph's death or what was said at his bedside, but that silence isn't entirely empty. By looking really closely at first-century Galilean customs, how a family grieved, what fell on the shoulders of the eldest son, and the earliest traditions of the church, we can carefully piece together the shape of this intensely relatable human experience.
Section 1. The Quiet Carpenter, the man who claimed a son.
To really grasp the depth of this loss, we first have to understand the man himself. Joseph was what the Greeks called a tekton, basically a craftsman who worked with wood and stone. He built the doors, the roof beams, just the everyday things a village needed. It was tough, honest, physical work. But his character? That was defined by extraordinary sacrifices and a really deep instinct for mercy. Think about it. He took Mary into his home, completely shielding her from severe public disgrace. When King Herod threatened the child's life, Joseph literally uprooted his entire world, fleeing across the desert into Egypt as a refugee to protect a boy who wasn't even his by blood. When it was finally safe, he brought them back, settled in Nazareth, and built a foundation for his family. And the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that he loved and raised Jesus completely as his own son, no qualifications whatsoever.
Moving on to Section 2, the hidden years, shaping the Son of God.
The bond between this father and son was forged right where fathers and sons in that world spent their days, in the workshop. Those years are honestly some of the most overlooked in all of history. The Gospels tell us Jesus was known as the carpenter's son and a carpenter himself. Hour after hour, day after day, Joseph taught him how to choose good timber, how to be patient with the wood, and how to take real pride in honest work. But he didn't just teach him how to cut timber, right? He modeled faithful manhood. In their world, the father taught the son the scriptures, led the family prayers by lamplight, and took the boy down to the synagogue. Later on, when Jesus taught huge crowds about a loving, providing, and patient Father in heaven, he was drawing from the human image he knew best. Somewhere behind that massive theological concept stood the quiet carpenter of Nazareth. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer scale of those hidden years. Just look at this ratio, 10-1. For every single year Jesus spent preaching and healing in his public ministry, he spent 10 years living the quiet, ordinary life of a carpenter's household. Roughly 30 years were spent in that small house in Nazareth, doing ordinary work completely anchored by Joseph.
Which brings us to Section 3, the missing father, the quiet disappearance. After anchoring this family for years, there is a glaring, total silence regarding Joseph. He's front and center all through the early story. The betrothal, the frantic flight to Egypt, the return to Nazareth, and then we hit that stressful search in the temple when Jesus was 12, where Mary actually refers to Joseph as your father. After that one glimpse, total silence. He is literally never mentioned again as a living person. He's not at the wedding at Cana, he's not at the ministry, and he's nowhere to be seen at the cross.
So the crucial point here, the big historical clue, comes at the very end. As Jesus hangs dying on the cross, he looks down at Mary and his disciple John and says, "Woman, behold your son," officially entrusting his mother to John's care. Now, if Joseph had still been alive, a wife would belong with her husband. Jesus wouldn't have handed his mother over into another man's protection. The simple fact that he had to make provision for Mary as a widow proves plainly that by the time of the crucifixion, Joseph was already dead.
Let's look at Section 4, a son's grief facing the end.
So if Joseph died before the start of the ministry, it means he died during those hidden years. And in that culture, when a father aged and weakened, the heavy responsibility of a deathbed fell right on the eldest son.
Jesus would have cared for Joseph, provided for the household, and stood by him at the very end in that small house in Nazareth. The earliest traditions of the church preserve this really profound contrast between the deaths of this father and son. Joseph's death is remembered as the gentlest death imaginable, dying of old age, peacefully in his bed, surrounded by the loving arms of Mary and Jesus. His life's work was done. Compare that to the death his son would one day face. Young, violent, intensely public, and abandoned by most of his closest friends. The father was granted the peaceful end, the son would ultimately be denied.
But what did Jesus actually do when Joseph died? Well, first, he grieved. We absolutely cannot skip past this. Jesus was fully human, and a fully human young man who loses the father who raised him feels the crushing, hollow ache of that loss. Remember the shortest verse in the Bible from years later, Jesus wept. If he stood at the tomb of his friend Lazarus and cried tears of deep love, imagine the profound, earth-shattering grief he felt losing the father who had been there his entire life.
Next came the immediate, hands-on work of a first-century Galilean burial, which naturally fell to the eldest son. Jesus would have helped wash Joseph's body, anoint it with oil and spices, wrap it in linen cloths, and lay it in a rock-cut tomb. Think about the poignant symmetry here for a second. The hands Joseph had taught to work wood now performed the last act of tender care for him. And years later, the son who prepared his father's body would receive exactly the same loving care, the washing, the spices, the linen, and a tomb from the people who loved him. And then came the part of grief that is, honestly, the hardest of all, waking up the next day. After the mourners leave, life just has to go on. Jesus walked back into a workshop where Joseph would never stand again. He picked up the tools his father had taught him to use, and he kept working. Because the family still had to eat, Jesus stepped up to run the workshop, becoming the sole provider and the main protector for his widowed mother.
Section 5. An ordinary legacy, the holiness of the hidden life.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is why this completely unrecorded history matters so profoundly. The legacy of Joseph's death is monumental. First, it taught Jesus human grief from the inside. Later on, when he met the widow of Nain or the grieving sisters Mary and Martha, he wasn't just some distant observer, he intimately knew the empty chair and the hollow ache of a lost loved one. Second, it positioned Jesus as the head of the household, a massive responsibility he carried faithfully right up to the cross when he ensured Mary was cared for. And third, Joseph modeled a faithful, quiet way of loving that the son carried forward into everything he did.
Let's bring this right back to you and me. Most of us will live lives much more like Joseph's than the famous globe-trotting figures of history. We simply work, provide for the people we love, and try to be faithful in the small duties of ordinary days. Joseph's quiet, unrecorded devotion proves that an ordinary life of showing up without applause is incredibly holy. He raised the Son of God simply by being faithful in obscurity. The hidden life is not the wasted life.
I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. What is the profound legacy of an unrecorded ordinary life? Joseph never preached to a crowd, he never performed a miracle, and he literally never spoke a single recorded word in the text. His task was simply to love, protect, and prepare the way in humble fashion. I challenge you to look at your own life and find real value in those small, unseen duties of love, just as the carpenter who raised the Son of God did. Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer, and I hope this reframes how you look at the quiet heroes in your own life.